OxSys. I hope the work can go on cleaner and with more denoising. And I'm sure it will happen. We are going to listen now to Antoniya Georgieva. She's going to talk about big data for intrapartum fetal monitoring, the OxSys system. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you.
This will be the future in terms of big data-driven analysis. Okay, so.
Thank you. We also think this is the future, and that's why I'm going to be a little bit difficult today and actually talk a little bit about artificial neural networks in deep learning. But I promise you there will be no equations, and I'll be very, very general in my overview. But I think it's time for all the clinicians in this room to actually get a better idea of what we are talking about. But before that, I'm going to talk a bit more familiar things as well. I'm going to go very quickly through the concept and through the basis of what we do at Oxford. I'm going to go very quickly through some slides that some of you may have seen, and there are details in the published papers. So I'm going to get to the more interesting parts quicker, but I'll give the fundamental. So what we do at Oxford is we are by now having about 100,000 term CTGs, deliveries at term, with details about antepartum and intrapartum clinical risk factors, as well as neonatal outcomes. And the goal is to combine the CTG analysis together with the risk factors that are of interest and provide data-driven, individualized risk assessment continuously throughout labor. So this is very much building on decades of experience with developing and maintaining the antepartum dose Redmond system. So this is Chris Redmond. Chris, give a wave. He's there. So he started looking at the CTGs with computers already in the 70s and 80s, if I'm right. Yeah, long before I was born. So the idea is that this idea already exists. The antepartum system has been in clinical practice for quite a while. It's been very useful and very well accepted by clinicians usually. And what we are doing is very much the same concept. It's just it's a lot harder in labor, right? Because things are dynamic. But I want to start with that and say that, Chris obviously had the vision to start collecting the data that we do systematically since 1993, but he was having CTGs in digital format already earlier. So as a concept, it shouldn't be such a revolutionary concept. I don't know why it is. And so for some people it was obvious long ago. Anyway, very quickly through the active data that I work, I mostly work with 60,000 for the moment. I've got another 40,000 ready, but they're sitting a little bit on the side for validation and future development. Whenever needed, I work with a smaller data set now in red. So some results I show are on the 24,000, some results are on the green. Don't worry too much about it, the details are in the paper. The important thing is that we group our data according to exclusive outcome groups. So we have severe compromise, which may or may not have acidemia. So about a third of them are actually perfectly normal gases at birth, and about a third have acidemia, cord gases acidemia, and about a third are kind of in between somewhere. And we've got here intermediate group. So these are the ones that have acidemia, but they don't have clinical signs of problems. We've got a mild compromise, which we don't really know what to do with, in a sense, if the clinicians want to intervene in these traces, and if our softwares are wanting to intervene in these traces, we don't know really to punish, we don't want to really punish the softwares or say that the clinicians are doing a false positive. But importantly, we have the normal outcome, so that's the big chunk of the data, and that's where we feel that you're far from acidemia, there are no clinical signs, that it's largely likely that a lot of the deliveries that were done for fetal distress in that group were unnecessary. And certainly if your software is screening that you need to deliver that baby urgently, and it's very far from acidemia and has no clinical signs of compromise, likely a lot of these alerts would be false positives. So we can use that to come with a benchmark, right? So we can look at our data retrospectively, we know what happened in clinical practice, and we can look at the percentage of operative deliveries in each of the groups that were for presumed fetal compromise or fetal distress. So there could be a delivery for another reason, but the ones that were primarily driven by the CTG and the concern for the baby, the clinician thought this baby was a danger of suffocating, let's get it out early. Right? And these about a third of them usually are cesarean sections. So these are emergency cesarean sections in labor. And about 2/3 are forceps or von Schultz deliveries. So this is at the second stage of labor. This is when you're already accessing the head to a degree, and you can help the baby out with tools, which is also not fun though. And what we can do is now, when we are developing our data-driven software, is we can compare to that benchmark, right? In principle, at the bench. And we can see our OxSys 1.5 system that has been now published a few years ago, and that's a proof of principle system. It's very, very basic. It does very intuitive things that I will go quickly through. And it was, for us, was really proof of principle that you can use that data and you can start improving on clinical practice on the bench. These are statistically significant differences. You can see here that we are detecting a little bit more of the severe compromises earlier. We are reducing the false positive rate a little bit. Of course, for clinical purposes, we don't think that's good enough. We don't want to go and test this in clinical practice tomorrow. But as a proof of principle for a very simple system, we believe it's doing a really good job. So, and you can see the clear titration, right? And that's what you want. And this is what the clinicians are doing as well. The more severe the problems are, the more clinicians are spotting them. But the false positive rate, as we know, is very high. And this is the false positive rate I see in other data sets around Europe. About 16-17% of completely normal babies, non-asymptotic, not problematic, are taken out. About 1/3 of them with cesarean section. It's really, really high, as you know. So OxSys 1.5, as I said, very fundamental. It has 3 principles behind it. Principle number 1 is the DC, the Deceleration Capacity, or PRSA, as I used to call it more before, phase rectified signal averaging. Forget about it. DC, Deceleration Capacity. What it does is it's looking for trends downhill. It looks for 15 to 30 minutes windows, depending on what I'm doing. It's looking for the downward trends and takes the averages in that window. So, of course, the more decelerations you have, the deeper they are, the steeper they are, the bigger your DC is. The more time you spend at baseline, the flatter your trace is, the smaller that DC is. It's very, very basic. It's very robust to signal noise, right? If there is no signal, it skips it. If there is a big signal noise somewhere, it gets averaged around with the others, so it doesn't really distort your metric. So I find it really robust for this kind of noisy, difficult data we have. The concept is as well that it looks at decelerations overall. It doesn't look for late decelerations. It doesn't need. We've tried. We don't find anything more useful. So that's one of the backbones. And then if that DC goes over a certain threshold for 15 minutes or more, then we signal an alert. So that's considered okay alert from the system. And here are a few examples. This is a very flat trace on top. It's 1 hour of non-reactive trace, what we call. There is no cyclicity, there is no reactivity, there are no deceleration. The DC is very low, 0.36, so you don't see that very often. The middle one here, it's very normal, accelerations, good reactivity, DC of about 3, that's very normal. A lot of the traces start with this kind of DC. And here I show you one where the DC progresses within 1 hour. It goes from 5.337. You see in this 15 minutes, you do have baseline, you have significant decels, but you maintain your baseline. But the DC is higher, right? And here it's becoming really high, 8.1. But it's a metric that intuitively clinicians can also understand. If you look at these traces for a while, you actually are quite good at estimating what the DC would be. It's not that different from what clinicians anyways think about deceleration. It's simpler though, and more robust. So that's fundamental principle 1. The fundamental principle 2 is that we do care about the clinical risk factors. For example, if in our bigger data set, the background risk for severe compromise is 1 in 118. And if you just look at the chunk of data that has DC above a certain threshold at any point of their CTG, you already know you're at double the risk. Nothing major, but actually, for the same DC, for the same CTG, if you know it's a first baby, if you know it's older mom, if you know there's stiff meconium, you can see how you're actually 10-fold increased risk. And that's a concept that doctors do all the time. It's completely intuitive as well. You're looking at the same CTG, but if you're confident that that baby is well, placenta is well, cord is well, everything else is well, you might actually sit on abnormal trace more comfortably, and if you are concerned for that baby already, so it's really adding different risk factors. Nothing revolutionary there as well. And the third fundamental concept is the initial trace, or the non-reactive initial trace, as we call it. If you're starting with a trace like this, you can't expect that baby to have the normal features of acidosis, and I think Austin is going to talk tomorrow, hopefully, a lot about that, right? And it's something that Austin has been instrumental as well in, highlighting. It's something that a lot of clinicians as well know and understand, but sometimes they forget, actually, some of them. But OxSys implements that. It evaluates the first 1 hour. If it's non-reactive, flags it already at that time. It doesn't look for disease. It doesn't look for decelerations. It flags it already. One thing we've done, some of this was past information. One thing we've done more recently is that we put that OxSys 1.5 on a device. We saw Pavel, who is here, he's going to give a wave there next to us. Pavel, give a wave. So he's done a really good job in creating this app. So we have now this tablet, and this is one of the prototypes. It was running earlier. You can play around with it later and look at some demo traces and real-time analysis of OxSys 1.5. This one there, it works in real time in our hospital. You can see any trace anywhere in the hospital, antepartum, intrapartum, admission unit, and it analyzes in real time. It's a research prototype for now. And here we've got the demo. Of course, we don't have real access to your data through this one for ethical reasons, no others. Technologically, the reason we did that is as well to demonstrate technologically it's not an issue at all. It's not a problem. It can sit anywhere you want in the hospital where the clinicians want to use it. And of course, the interface is just a beginning. It can change a lot. It can be tailored to what clinicians want. This one takes in clinical risk factors from the user, so you can input if there is thick meconium as it arises or maternal fever as it happens in labor. You can input that, and the tablet will update analysis, of course, accordingly. So this is where we are now, more or less. This is what it's in my head. No wonder I'm so stressed out. So what I believe is that it's a very complex problem, clearly, and we need to take every tool in our toolbox to try to improve that data-driven analysis. So I'm not satisfied to just look at statistical prediction models or just deep learning or just, I don't want to close the door to anything. We are taking a comprehensive approach. We are doing all kind of, that's why it's taking so long. We are taking different things to make sure we have that system as good as possible. Today I'm going to touch a little bit on contemporary HIE cohorts. So you see most of the data I showed so far is until 2011. But we have looked in the more recent data, and tomorrow you're going to hear more about it. I'm going to speak about deep learning, as I said, and later today I'm going to show you some of the results on animal data that we've got. So here is the contemporary HIE data. So Anna, who is now there, Anna, wave, please. So she's done a fantastic job collecting that data and being instrumental in me understanding and learning more about the neonatologist perspective. Again, my background is not clinical, so any help from clinicians is always appreciated. She's been very patient. She's going to show you a bit more tomorrow, but what I want to demonstrate is we are looking at these ones, and what is important is that we have a lot of information for them. We have MRIs, we have follow-ups, we have things that we didn't have in the 90s or in the early 20s. So all of this, so Anna is not going to be excluding sentinel events tomorrow, because from her perspective, of course, all the babies that come with hypoxia are babies with hypoxia, and you need to treat them. From our perspective, it's a little bit, what is the CTG telling me in that sentinel event? So that's also interesting, but you'll see more tomorrow. What I want to demonstrate is that this is a small overview of that data. We've got a lot of boys, we've got a lot of thick meconium, we have very little acidemia. OxSys 1.5 works very well. It's actually a little bit better than on the severe compromise, and still significantly better than operative deliveries due to presume. So only about 40% of these are HIE babies, severe ones or moderate ones. We'll see tomorrow. So OxSys is doing very well. What I want to show, so this is a validation data set for us, right? This data was not used for the training. So what is important here is to see alerts due to the non-reactive initial trace. So we have nearly 15% of HIE babies in this contemporary cohort arriving on this non-reactive initial trace. Very quick, you've seen different versions of this. Again, I'm reminded the reason why I started that project for the HIE contemporary. Again, what are the pathways to HIE? We don't understand. It's a heterogeneous condition. You clinicians, physiologists as well, are not able to tell us actually, us engineers, how do you end up with these very sick babies? What are the pathways so that we can look for different CTG patterns and different risk factors in the different pathways to get there? And here is just a random figure. It keeps on changing with time. I'm grateful always to contributors over time to it. It's floating in the air. This is not finished in any way. I've just plugged in here non-reactive trace. What I want to have eventually is here be able to say what's the contribution of each pathway. How many arrived on a sinusoidal trace with a hemorrhage? Very rare, right? How many arrived on a non-reactive trace? How many arrived with normal and then developed decelerations over time, and so on. So yeah, so that was very brief. About the non-reactive initial trace, I'll just show you something that I did last week. So I haven't finished with the non-reactive initial trace. I don't have a lot of time, but I keep on improving it with time. I think it can get improved even more, the detection of it. So here, for example, in the smaller data set, you can see that we've got 199 severe compromises, 640 moderate compromise, so this is acidemia. And that kind of equates to 1 severe compromise versus 101 healthy ones, so these are the normal ones. Right? And if you look at a logistic regression model I did just last week as well, looking at the first hour of the CTG, plus a few clinical risk factors, you can see that you don't need to alert more than 1.2% of the time. So this is percentage out of the total data set. And this is a high-risk data set anyways, because it's got the CTG on and it's got cord gases there. So in a general population, this would be even less. It will be alerting less than 1% of the time. But you'll be catching 10% of the severe compromises here in this data set, right there in the first 1 hour, which doctors in many ways are already doing. And you can see the price for it, right? 6 fully healthy for 1 which has acidemia or severe compromise, based on this data, of course. And for example, this 19 that you can catch here, all of them, the alerts are a lot earlier than. So this is the time of alert, hours before birth. So you can see at least half of them got 5 hours earlier on alert than actually what happened in clinical practice. And this is the bigger data set. So this is older clinical practice. Our current clinical practice is a little bit better with these ones. And you can still see that most of them had some kind of a intervention anyways. Only 27% had spontaneous birth. You know, doctors are picking these ones, but if you can do that more objectively, more reliably, very early on, you are saving a lot of trouble. So that was the more clinical parts. Now, deep learning. So this is a workshop, so I want to teach you a little bit about it. I don't want you to be scared of this very big title. So this is a paper we published, and this is the lovely student, crazy Italian young chap who did a lot of the work. He's not going to wait. He's not here. He started his job in London, and he's not doing research anymore, which is what happens to machine learning experts often, unless they're very committed to saving babies like me. So we've got that scary title, Multi-Modal Convolutional Neural Networks. So by the end of this talk, I want all of you to know what that means. So artificial neural networks. So open your listening ears, please, attention. So very, very simple. You know how in biology we have our inputs. For example, I'm walking here, I see inputs, and that's telling me, oh, I need to turn. I make a decision. It's processing in parallel, my inputs from my eyes, from my ears, and from other things. Things are happening very quickly in parallel. And then I make a decision, okay, I want to turn this way, or I want to bump. Usually it's through experience. Usually when you're 1 or 2, you bump all the time, and you're learning actually to turn around. But the point is that you have your inputs, and things are happening very quickly in a parallel lab. So you've got your synapses, and they're firing in different directions. And they're highly interconnected. So when people came up with artificial neural networks, they felt greatly inspired that that's what you do. You have your inputs, you have some information, and inside is a mess, or not, it's organized mess. There's a lot of things happening simultaneously. And then you have some kind of output and decision. So the artificial neural networks theory existed already from the 50s and 60s and 70s. There's been a lot of mathematics behind it. It's a very well-established mathematical theory. There is quite a few theorems that prove that something like this can approximate any actually complex function, which is huge if you do it properly. They are very, very powerful. And also over time, people have done a lot of research with them, and there are very established rules of how you control it, how you supervise it, how you do everything. You're like a god. So you're the one, if you're a machine learning expert, who decides how to structure it. So if you're a god, you're creating that person, let's say. I apologize for the religious people, but as a concept, you put the limitations. You decide that there are that many neurons. You're the one who creates that human being, right? And then the human being thinks on his own, if you wish. So as a creator of that artificial neural network, you have a lot of control. It's not a random black box. I don't agree actually with that. You understand a lot of what's going on if you are good at it and if you've been doing it for your PhD like I did back in the day. So what happens here is if you're looking at a CTG, right? You might be seeing, oh, the baseline is 150, right? You're doing some processing. Oh, I know it's a nulliparous woman. I know it's a first baby, which is a higher risk. And I can kind of, or I have a software, or I estimate that the short-term variability is 5.3. I just put these things as an example, right? And because I like DC, I put DC, it's 4. Right? So this is your information. You've looked at that CTG, that's your information. And what you do is, inside, you have a lot of calculations, and they are interconnected. So you're very, very flexible. You do something very complex that none of us can do. Only the computer can do. But ultimately, it comes up with a number and says, I predict that our baby is a high risk, 0.7 risk. So the output often would be between 0 and 1. 1 is, I predict is a very sick baby. 0 is, I predict is a healthy baby. And it just spits that out. At the very beginning, when you start, it's going to be very completely random. It's just going to come up with a number like this. But that's when you come with your training example. You know the real outcome. You say, listen, that's 0, and you made an error of 0.7. Right? And you put that information back, and the network automatically reshuffles its parameters, right? It still stays the same architecture, so the same number of structure, but it changes the way they operate. And it's aiming to come up with a 0 here. And if it was just this one example, it would be very easy. You would just tell the network, listen, you've made a mistake of 0.7. It would just adjust and come up with a 0. The problem is you do it in parallel with thousands and thousands of other cases. So here you will be having ones and other zeros and so on. And the network will have the task simultaneously to come up with a number that is as close as 0 here, but a number here who is matching as much as possible the next one. So it's highly computationally expensive, but it's a lot more powerful than any of us can do. What we can do is teach it. And we give that information and say, listen, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And then there is a level, when you're an expert in it, you know when it's the level for you to stop training. There is a limit. And then that network is, okay, I can't get any better, right? And there are ways to do that. It's not completely in the sky. Okay? So this is the artificial neural network concept. Any questions or thoughts? Did I lose you completely? Okay, well, so this is when people talk about artificial neural networks, right? It's mathematics. It's a calculator. It's a big calculator. You put in numbers and you get an output. It's a very sophisticated calculator, but we shouldn't be scared of it because it can give us power that, we just we would be stupid to ignore it just because we can't do it ourselves. So when people talk about the deep learning concept, so that's a newer thing. When I did my PhD 12 years ago or 15 years ago in neural networks, the deep learning concept didn't exist. Everything else is the same. All the established theory, all the expertise over the decades of people who have worked on machine learning stays. Okay, all of the overfitting here, all the things that we know how to do if we are good, experienced neural network people, they stay. But as a concept, what you're able to do is now put the raw CTG in here. So you're not anymore looking at some inputs. You're actually not limited to that at all. You can toss the whole raw CTG. The reason is that we are so much more powerful now than 15 years ago, than 10 years ago, than even 5 years ago, that here we can do crazy computations. So actually this calculator now can cope with the raw CTG. So it doesn't depend on me thinking baseline is important, doesn't depend on me thinking short-term variability is important. It will find what's important in the CTG on its own, if you give enough training data and enough computational resources. But that's the only difference. So when we say deep learning, everything else is the same in terms of theory, in terms of, of course there are details, but it's a concept. So it's something we know how to do. It's not some kind of news that we are now learning how to do. We know how to do these things. We've been doing them for decades. We just now have the computational power. And I'm very excited that, for example, Google announced last week as well about the quantum-powered CPU. Not everyone is believing in processing time with quantum power, but I actually do, because I have a good friend who works in that, and he doesn't believe in it, so that's why I believe in it. But we would probably be likely, in 5 to 10 years, do even more here than we can do now. We are going to get even more powerful. That's why it's the time for you to actually get a bit more familiar. So, deep learning concept. When you see that complicated word convolution and convolutional neural networks, that's all to do with what happens here. So it's not something you should worry about ever, really. Leave that to the experts in machine learning. Just because it's called convolutional and sounds it's actually, you shouldn't worry about it. It's all to do here of how now this network will be finding what's important in the CTG. And I have a very simple example here that I stole from that guy on the internet. I don't know him. He just has a good tutorial on convolution. And it's just an example here of if you had a 2D image of that car, this is the filter or the convolution. So you apply this thing, don't worry about it, the computer does it, but you get something like this. It extracts important information of that image in some sort that now can be processed a little bit more easily. And then in the convolutional neural networks, that's done at a huge scale, right? So these filters are bigger, smaller, ones are changed to threes are changed to tens, you know. So the computer does millions and millions of operations and extract different information like this. It's the same with the CTG, it's just more beautiful and illustrated example with the car. But it's the same with the CTG. It will try different things, different convolutions to find the ones that are most important, right? So it's looking for the most important features. So that was it. So I'll show you some results of what we've done, right? But now hopefully you have an idea what's convolution. It's this kind of filters, this little matrices, and it's transforming your data to something that it's a bit different. And you do that millions, well, not millions, but you do that few hundreds of times with different ways, and then your network has different information. So what we did recently is that we applied convolutional neural networks to CTG, which, as far as I know, was the first time. I think you were doing something, but I'm not sure it's. So correct me if I'm wrong. As far as I know, it was the first time. And for me, it was very exciting because I was skeptical. I didn't really believe in it. And with Patrice, we were talking in SPAM 2017, the deep learning, you know, for this very complex problem is probably not going to give us much. And I was healthily skeptic like this, but I had a lovely student, and I was very pleasantly surprised. So now I'm a believer. Now I'm hyped about deep learning, and I hope you will be a bit more hyped. So we had 35,000 deliveries. This is classic. We used as many as possible for training. So this is the ones you show to the network. So we showed 30,000 different outcomes, right? 30,000 different babies. And that's like it should be at least 30,000. Ideally, it should become many more. And we kept aside a testing set of 5,000, right? Which we don't show to the network, and we show at the end only. And we did multi-modal convolutional neural network in that work. So the details are in the paper. I've got some printed copies here. That's the second generation with that. But the idea with this multi-modal is that here you put in the contraction signal on its own, and it's unrelated to the heart rate signal for the same time. And here we put in some quality metrics for the heart rate signal, just as an experiment. Next time here we can put the clinical risk factors as well. Tomorrow we can put biomarkers or biometrics. Whatever we want, it can come independently. There are different processing there. The CNN is the convolutional neural network. And then they join together, and the information from each is then modeled together to come up with an output. The same concept, you have the input and you come up with a probability, right? A number between 0 and 1. So we did that with 30,000, and then we went and tested it on the 5,000 that we never used so far for that deep learning model. And it's the same concept here, it's just they're swapped around. These are the normal ones. We know the clinical practice is about 16%. It's true in this subset as well. It's a well-random selected. We know OxSys 1.5 works a little bit better. It reduces the false positive a little bit. Yeah. And we told to the neural network now that we have, so we get a probability from the network, right? And we can threshold it and say everyone who is above 0.5 is high risk. Everyone who is below 0.5 is healthy, right? Or low risk. So choosing where to put that threshold, whether it's 0.5 or 0.6 or whatever, that's what determines. We said we don't want false positive rate more than clinical practice. Freeze that and see what my sensitivity will be. How many will it be? So here I have severe or moderate together, and you can see the clinical practice about 30%. We know that from the prior data as well. We got here OxSys 1.5. We know we improved a little bit, and here we see the deep learning model is improving even further on that. Not massively, but it's improving. The fun was when we split that severe or moderate into chordocidemia or no chordocidemia, right? And then you can see that actually the deep learning model is very good at detecting acidemia. It's nearly doubling the detection rate when compared to clinical practice. This is acidemia without severe compromise. But in the babies with severe compromise without acidemia, it's pretty much failing, especially in comparison to OxSys 1.5. And that's because OxSys 1.5 was designed with this non-reactive rule in mind, with these clinical risk factors in mind, right? So in future work, we can benefit from both. It's not like we take deep learning, we forget everything else. And the message is that, of course, here with more work, with more neural networks, with more data, because this is very heterogeneous data set. These severe compromises without acidemia, there is no one pathway, there is no one CTG pattern in them. They're very different. So the neural network completely didn't learn that. And when we tested it on outside data, it maintains its performance on completely different centers. That's all in the paper, so we'll skip. And we tried, and we'll keep on trying more clinically relevant models where you estimate probability early on, and you feed that to the next network, and the next so you have so over time progress. But that's kind of the main thing, and I'm happy to take questions. The paper is here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Questions, but before speaking of deep learning, you were comparing percentage of what the percentage you were comparing? Percentage of what?
So here in this one?
Yes, yes.
So it's the same as the previous graphs. Percentage of alerts, percentage of interventions in clinical practice because of fetal distress.
But so
percentage of alerts.
How about the absolute numbers? Because you compare percentage, but it might be that there are much less alerts altogether for deep learning, for instance. So that.
But it's the same data set. So here it's a proportion. 15% is 15%. The absolute number would be similar. It's in the paper.
It's the number of the actual alerts that have been seen by the.
Okay, you've got 5,000 birds, right? A big chunk of them are normal, right? In these normal, you ask how many times did you alert? Whatever is the number, it's in the paper. And that was what percentage of the normal ones? So it would be.
Yeah, but it could be that one method is giving 3 times less alert than another method. Comparing percentage.
Well, then this would be a lot lower. No, this would be a lot lower if it's giving a lesser number, because this is the whole chunk of normals.
How percentage of the.
Yeah, but it's in the paper. Have a look. No, it would be lower. It would be lower because the percentage would be lower.
Okay.
It's the same data set, so.
Okay. Now I see. Okay, and now back to deep learning. Can you tell us a bit more what you're actually providing the network with, like the time series outline?
Yeah, so it's in the paper. I didn't want to go into much detail.
Yeah, but these details are.
So here's some basics, but it's in the paper. So what we did here, it's very basic. It's a proof of concept as well. We took the last hour of CTG. We smoothed it. So we are at 0.25 hertz, right? And we took the heart rate, rho. And we took the contraction signal, rho. And if the contraction signal was not meeting certain criteria, we didn't use it. We put a flat line because it can be very noisy and confuses the network. That's in the previous paper. And we put a quality metric for the fetal heart rate in the paper.
Thank you. Another question?
I don't know if this is working. Probably not.
Okay, so your network has binary outputs, healthy, non-healthy, or is it something more than that?
Continuous between 0 and 1.
What? A number between 0 and 1?
Yes.
Does it also provide information about uncertainty of?
Yes.
So you have a probabilistic output as well?
Yeah, it is probabilistic output. So it's 0.6, 0.8. So yeah, it would give you confidence in.
And the results were obtained by basically processing 1 hour of data?
Yes, the last hour.
Have you tried to work with a real-time way of doing it so that you actually provide data as the data come in?
Yeah, so we tried a little bit in the paper of this kind of scenario where we do one neural network in an earlier stage, in the first stage of labor, and then we use that probability to feed into another neural network with the newer data and then update its estimates. And we think that's the future in general. This worked okay, but it didn't really improve a lot on what we had. And it's first steps. I think that's what people should be doing now, obviously.
Thank you, Diogo. Austin, we have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, so okay. Diogo, we still have, and we started 10 minutes later.
So it's for the OxSys 1.5, for the DCs, the deceleration capacity. Did I understand correctly that you actually calculated a baseline for that?
No.
No. So
DC
it's
doesn't use a baseline at all.
no baseline at all.
That's what makes it so beautiful.
Okay, so deceleration capacity, actually, if you have accelerations and decelerations, it will get both accelerations and decelerations.
That's why I get that question a lot. It's just accelerations would not usually bring so much the DC. See, you've got very good accelerations here. They're bringing your DC up because you have downward trends. This would be bringing your DC, but it's never as dramatic as.
Okay, so it's not really just decelerations. It's the amplitude of the different, yeah? Okay, just make that clear.
I'll talk about it more later today. Quick with Austin, and then it's the next speaker, I think.
Thanks for the talk anyway.
Yeah, it's only it's only to be recorded on the recording.
All right, okay.
It's not amplified.
So perhaps you might not be able to deal with the question, but it's a good thing that Chris is here. You started by showing the 100,000 cases in the development of the Oxford system, which actually related to 10 babies.
Yeah.
But as you know, in clinical practice, the same principle is applied to preterm babies in terms of interpreting. And I just wondered whether it's valid in that setting, and if it is, what's that based on? If it isn't, why not?
We have not, so it would be actually completely incorrect to try to say it's valid in that setting because we have not tested it at all. So there is no scientific evidence at all that this could be valid or not valid. We do have the data for the preterm babies. We have the data for everyone. We don't have the money and the capacity. If there was a good researcher with their own funding and wants to look at premature and apply this, we do have the data, but we've never looked at it. Yeah, I wouldn't know. Without any research from my or from someone that I know, like, I wouldn't know. Maybe it's correct to apply. Chris, what do you think? But it's a good question. I think he means generally, even visual analysis.
We have to allow for gestation of the dogs. And Tools Redmond does, and a primitive the threshold is checked according to the gestation of the baby. So this is space.
Later.
Okay, so I think we are on time.
Sorry, Jerry, but you can ask me later. I think it's time for the next speaker. We can. I'll give another talk later, so I think it's more than enough attention.
Okay. So now we are going to